There's something about footprints in snow that makes you believe in certainty. Each impression tells a story of weight and direction, of someone who was here, walking toward there. But what happens when the story simply stops? When two sets of tracks, side by side, approach the edge of everything and then become nothing at all. On March 15, 1933, Sheriff William Hayes followed such tracks through the forests of Greylock County, Massachusetts. The snow had fallen for 18 hours straight, then cleared to reveal a perfect record of the final journey of Evelyn and Lillian Marks. 22 and 19 years old, respectively, the sisters had walked 3 miles through deepening drifts, their path unwavering, their steps synchronized. Until they weren't. The tracks ended at Widow's Point, where granite cliffs dropped 200 feet into Crane River. No marks disturbed the snow beyond that edge. No signs of struggle scarred the pristine white. The sisters had simply walked to the brink of the world and vanished, leaving behind only questions that would echo through a town already haunted by too many disappearances. Cedar Ridge had always been a town that kept its secrets close. Tucked into the Berkshire Mountains, where Massachusetts bleeds into New York, it survived on timber, whispers, and the stubborn belief that some things were better left unspoken. The winter of 1933 had been particularly harsh on such beliefs. The Marks family lived on Elm Street in a white clapboard house that had seen better decades, before the banks failed, before the mill closed, before half the town's men took to the rails looking for work that might not exist. James Marks still rose at 5 each morning to tend a hardware store that fewer people could afford to visit, while his wife Margaret took in mending from families who had mending to spare. Evelyn and Lillian moved through this diminished world with a peculiar grace. Where other young women in Cedar Ridge had grown sharp with worry or soft with resignation, the Marks sisters maintained something that neighbors struggled to name. Not quite hope. That would have been naive in 1933. Not quite acceptance. That would have been surrender. Something in between, perhaps. Something that made them walk with their heads up even when walking became difficult. They always seemed like they knew something the rest of us didn't, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins would tell the state investigators weeks later. Not in a proud way, mind you. Just settled somehow. Like they'd made peace with circumstances that still had the rest of us wrestling. The town's first disappearance had occurred in November. Thomas Brennan, a railroad man passing through, had checked into Murphy's Inn and simply never checked out. His belongings remained untouched, his bed unslept in. The only trace of his presence was a half-eaten meal growing cold in the dining room and a lingering smell of pipe. Tobacco that seemed to follow certain people down certain streets. December brought Agnes Morrison, a schoolteacher whose absence was discovered only when children arrived, to find their classroom locked and dark. No note of explanation. No word to the principal. Her house showed no signs of disturbance beyond an open book left spine up on the kitchen table, pages fluttering in a wind that shouldn't have been able to reach them. By January, Cedar Ridge had developed the peculiar tension of a community under siege by its own imagination. People walked faster after sunset. Conversations grew shorter and less frequent. The general consensus seemed to be that if nobody talked about the disappearances, they might stop happening. This was the atmosphere into which March arrived with unprecedented snow. The blizzard began on March 14th, with a whisper of wind through pine needles and the particular quality of light that makes experienced New Englanders check their wood supplies and cancel their plans. By noon, the snow was falling in sheets so thick you couldn't see the house across the street. By evening, it had transformed Cedar Ridge into something from a fairy tale. The dark kind, where forests swallow travelers and trails lead nowhere good. Margaret Marks watched her daughters prepare for what should have been a simple errand. The Winslow farm lay 2 miles north on the old logging road, and Mrs. Winslow had promised eggs for the family's weekly bread if someone could retrieve them before the storm grew worse. A reasonable request, a familiar journey. The kind of transaction that held small communities together when larger economies failed. "The tracks will be covered within the hour," Margaret observed, folding dish towels with unnecessary precision. "Perhaps it's better to wait." Evelyn adjusted her wool scarf with the careful movements of someone who'd made up her mind about something larger than eggs. At 22, she possessed the particular confidence of a young woman who'd never encountered a problem she couldn't solve through careful planning and steady determination. "Mrs. Winslow is counting on us," she said. "Besides, Lillian knows those woods better than the deer." This was not quite accurate, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. Lillian had always been drawn to the spaces between things, the gaps in conversation, the shadows between trees, the moments when familiar places revealed themselves to be something else entirely. At 19, she moved through the world with the fluid attention of someone perpetually listening to music only she could hear. "We'll be back before dark," Lillian added, pulling on mittens that their grandmother had knitted in better times. "The snow's beautiful right now, like walking through a cloud." Margaret continued folding towels, each crease sharp enough to cut paper. James looked up from his account books, numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times he rearranged them. "Perhaps I should," he began. "No," Evelyn said gently but firmly. "You have enough to worry about. We'll take the main path, check in with the Hendersons at the halfway point, and be home for supper." What nobody mentioned, what hung in the air like the scent of snow before snow, was that the Henderson place had been empty since New Year's Day. Another family lost to circumstances nobody wanted to examine too closely. Another set of neighbors who'd simply decided that somewhere else might be better than here, though nobody could say exactly where they'd gone or why they'd left their furniture behind. The sisters stepped into the storm at 3:47 p.m., their figures disappearing into white static before they'd reached the end of the drive. They would never be seen alive again. Sheriff William Hayes had been elected on a platform of competence and discretion, two qualities that 1933 had revealed to be more complex than the voters of Greylock County had initially appreciated. When Margaret Marks appeared at his office at 7:38 a.m. on March 15th, her face holding the particular emptiness of a mother whose world had just rearranged itself around an absence. Hayes understood immediately that discretion would not be sufficient for what was coming. "They should have been home by 6, Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of a night spent listening to wind that brought no footsteps. The storm cleared around midnight. I walked the road myself as far as Miller's Creek." Hayes had already noticed the quality of the morning light, that crystalline brightness that comes after heavy snow, when the world looks scrubbed clean and impossibly detailed. Perfect conditions for tracking. Perfect conditions for finding people who wanted to be found. The initial search party consisted of 6 men: Hayes, Deputy Frank Morrison, Dr. Charles Whitmore, and 3 volunteers from the Volunteer Fire Department. They followed the logging road north, their boots breaking through snow that recorded every movement with uncomfortable precision. "Here," Deputy Morrison called from a bend where the road curved past a stand of white birch. 2 sets of prints, heading toward Winslow's place. The tracks were remarkably clear, preserved by the particular combination of wind patterns and snowfall that occasionally gifts investigators with perfect evidence. Evelyn's prints were slightly larger, her gait longer and more measured. Lillian's were smaller, with the slightly turned-out pattern of someone who'd learned to walk on these forest paths when they were still soft with leaf mold rather than treacherous with ice. For the first mile and a half, the story the snow told was mundane and reassuring. The sisters had walked steadily north, occasionally stopping, probably to adjust scarves or mittens, but maintaining their direction toward the Winslow farm. They'd paused at the old logging bridge to test its stability under the snow load, then continued across without incident. Smart girls, Dr. Whitmore observed, taking their time, staying careful. But the Winslow farm, when they reached it, held only more questions wrapped in white silence. No tracks approached the house. No evidence that anyone had visited in days. Mrs. Winslow herself stood in her doorway, a figure of confusion wrapped in a heavy shawl. "I haven't seen them," she said, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the larger cloud of the search party's growing unease. "Nobody's been by since the snow started. I was expecting them yesterday, but when the storm got bad, I figured they'd stay home like sensible people." The search party exchanged glances that said what nobody wanted to speak aloud. If the sisters hadn't reached the Winslow farm, where had they gone? The answer lay in backtracking, in following the preserved story of their journey in reverse until it revealed its secret. A quarter-mile south of the farm, the prince told a different tale. Here, the sisters had stopped. Here, their tracks showed the circular pattern of people having a conversation. And here, for reasons that would haunt Cedar Ridge for decades to come, they had turned east, leaving the logging road for a deer path that led toward the high country, toward the cliffs, the weight of inevitability. The deer path that Evelyn and Lillian Marks had chosen wound through forest that became increasingly wild as it climbed toward the granite escarpment known locally as Widow's Point. Sheriff Hayes and his search party followed the perfectly preserved tracks through stands of hemlock and pine, each step taking them further from the comfortable narrative of a simple errand gone wrong. "Why would they leave the road?" Dr. Whitmore asked, his breath coming harder as the path steepened. "It makes no sense. They knew these woods, but not well enough to go wandering in a blizzard." Deputy Morrison knelt beside a place where the tracks showed another pause, another conversation frozen in snow. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the way the prints faced each other, the scuff marks that suggested emphatic gestures. They were deciding something here. One wanted to go back, the other wanted to keep going. Hayes studied the evidence with the methodical attention that had made him a competent sheriff in ordinary times. But these were not ordinary times, and the story the snow was telling belonged to something larger and stranger than a simple search and rescue. "Which one wanted to continue?" he asked. Morrison traced the patterns with his finger. "Hard to say for certain, but based on the size of the prints and the way they're positioned." He paused, reading the snow like a book written in a language few people bothered to learn. "I'd say it was the younger one, Lillian. She was facing uphill toward the cliffs. Evelyn was facing back toward town. But they went up. They went up." The search party continued climbing, following a trail that grew more treacherous with each 100 yards of elevation. The snow here was deeper, less disturbed by wind, holding the sisters' prints in perfect detail. Occasionally, Hayes would stop to examine a particularly clear impression, the pattern of a boot sole, the depth that suggested careful or hurried movement, the spacing that indicated whether they'd been walking together or single file. About halfway to the cliff edge, they found the first piece of physical evidence beyond footprints. A woolen mitten, dark blue with a white pattern around the cuff, half buried in snow beside a granite boulder that provided shelter from the wind. Dr. Whitmore picked it up with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence in a mystery that was rapidly becoming something else. "Lilians," he said quietly. "Margaret knitted them last winter. I remember because she asked me about the pattern when my wife was helping with the church social. The mitten was dry, suggesting it had been lost after the worst of the storm had passed. But more troubling were the circumstances of its abandonment. No tracks suggested the sisters had paused here long enough to remove clothing. No marks in the snow indicated a struggle or fall. People don't just lose mittens," one of the volunteers observed. "Not in weather like this. You'd notice immediately and stop to look for it. Unless," Hayes thought, but did not say, "you were no longer concerned with practical matters like keeping your hands warm." The path grew steeper, winding through a landscape that seemed designed to discourage human travel. Ancient hemlocks pressed close on both sides, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally released in small avalanches as the search party brushed past. The silence was profound, not the comfortable quiet of a winter forest, but something more absolute. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat and wish you weren't. "Sheriff," Morrison called from ahead, his voice carrying a note that made everyone stop walking. "You need to see this." The deputy was standing beside a massive pine tree, its trunk scarred by lightning from some long-ago storm. At its base, partially hidden by fallen snow, lay a lady's handbag made of brown leather, the kind of practical accessory that sensible women carried to hold the small necessities of daily life. Hayes approached the bag with the careful movements of someone who understood that some evidence changes everything. Inside, he found a few coins, a handkerchief with the initials EM embroidered in blue thread, a small notebook filled with household accounts, and a pencil worn down to half its original length. But what stopped his breathing was what he didn't find. Any indication of why two sensible young women would abandon practical belongings in the middle of a wilderness climb during a blizzard. The tracks continued upward, now showing signs of haste. Longer strides, deeper impressions, the occasional skid mark where someone had slipped on ice hidden beneath snow. Whatever conversation the sisters had been having, whatever decision they'd been debating, it had been resolved in favor of speed over safety. The final 100 yards to Widow's Point stretched ahead through trees that grew sparse and twisted, shaped by winds that carved patience from stone and left only the essential behind. Widow's Point earned its name from a tragedy that predated anyone's clear memory. Some story about a woman who'd lost her husband to the Civil War and chosen the cliffs as her place of final grief. Whether the legend held any truth mattered less than its function. It gave the community a way to speak about endings without having to examine them too closely. The granite promontory jutted 200 feet above the Crane River, offering views that stretched across 3 counties when weather permitted such luxuries. On clear days, you could see the Taconic Mountains rolling south toward Connecticut, the Connecticut River Valley spreading east toward Springfield, and the complicated geography of a region that had been shaped by ice, time, and human stubbornness in roughly equal measure. But March 15th, 1933, offered no such expansive perspectives. The search party emerged from the tree line onto a landscape that seemed designed for endings. Wind-scoured granite dusted with snow, scattered pines twisted into shapes that suggested permanent struggle, and beyond the cliff edge, a white void that could have been sky or ground, or the space between thoughts. The footprints that Sheriff Hayes and his men had followed for 3 miles ended here with a precision that defied comfortable interpretation. "Jesus," Dr. Whitmore whispered, and nobody corrected his language despite the circumstances. They stood in a rough semicircle, staring at evidence that made sense only if you accepted conclusions that reasonable people couldn't accept. The tracks of Evelyn and Lillian Marks approached the cliff edge in parallel lines, their spacing suggesting the sisters had walked hand in hand for the final 50 feet. The prints showed no hesitation, no sideways movement that might indicate they'd paused to look down, no scuff marks suggesting an attempt to stop or turn back. 20 feet from the edge, Lillian's tracks separated from her sister's, angling slightly to the right. 10 feet from the edge, they converged again. At the very brink of Widow's Point, the footprints simply stopped. Deputy Morrison walked the perimeter of the cliff top with methodical care, looking for any sign that the sisters' journey had continued beyond the granite ledge. He found nothing. No tracks led away from the precipice. No marks disturbed the snow on either side of the final prints. Most troubling of all, no disturbance marked the cliff edge itself. No broken stone, no scuff marks, no indication that anyone or anything had gone over. "It's impossible," Morrison said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man confronting evidence that violated the rules by which he'd organized his understanding of the world. People don't just disappear into thin air. But that was exactly what the snow suggested had happened. Hayes knelt beside the final set of prints, studying them with the intensity of someone trying to read meaning into marks that refused to yield their secrets. The impressions were deep and clear, showing the treaded pattern of good winter boots. No signs of struggle, no evidence of a slip or fall. The sisters had walked to the edge of everything and then become nothing, leaving behind only the mystery of their final moments and the terrible precision of snow that preserved stories without explaining them. "Search the base of the cliffs," Hayes ordered, though his voice suggested he already knew what they'd find. "Morrison, take 2 men and work your way down to the river. Look for anything: clothing, belongings, disturbance in the snow. I'll stay up here and see if we missed something." The search of the cliff base took 3 hours and revealed exactly nothing. The snow at the bottom of the granite walls was unbroken, unmarked by falling objects or human impact. The Crane River, visible through gaps in the trees, flowed black and quick beneath a skin of ice that showed no breaks, no evidence of disturbance from above. When the search party regrouped at the top of Widow's Point, as afternoon shadows grew long and blue, they carried with them the weight of a mystery that would transform Cedar Ridge from a community troubled by disappearances into something else entirely. A town that had lost its faith in the basic reliability of cause and effect. "What do we tell the family?" Dr. Whitmore asked, his question hanging in air so cold it seemed to crystallize words before they could reach understanding. Hayes looked out over the white landscape, trying to find an answer in geography that had suddenly become unreliable. "We tell them what we know," he said finally. "We tell them their daughters walked to this place and didn't walk away from it. But they couldn't tell them why, because the snow that had preserved everything else had chosen to keep that secret for itself. The emptiness between footsteps. News of the sisters' disappearance spread through Cedar Ridge with the particular velocity of information that changes everything while explaining nothing. By evening of March 15th, every household in town knew that Evelyn and Lillian Marks had vanished at Widow's Point, leaving behind only footprints that ended at the edge of impossibility. But knowledge and understanding proved to be entirely different things. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, who had made a career of observing her neighbors with scientific precision, found herself struggling to reconcile what she'd witnessed with what the authorities claimed to have discovered. Those girls weren't the type to go throwing themselves off cliffs, she told anyone willing to listen. Too practical by half, too concerned with their family's circumstances to go doing something dramatic and selfish. At Murphy's Inn, the usual evening gathering of men who had nowhere else to be found themselves debating possibilities that grew more unlikely with each round of coffee and cigarettes. The consensus seemed to be that authorities were either incompetent or actively concealing something, though nobody could agree on which possibility was more troubling. "Footprints don't just stop," declared Pete Morrison, the deputy's uncle and a man whose opinions carried weight despite, or perhaps because of, their frequent disconnection from observable reality. Either someone's lying about what they found up there, or we're dealing with something that doesn't follow ordinary rules. The suggestion that ordinary rules might not apply to Cedar Ridge's latest tragedy hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge they'd helped start. Dr. Whitmore found himself fielding questions he wasn't equipped to answer. As the town's only physician, he'd become accustomed to explaining the mysterious workings of the human body to people who needed simple answers for complicated problems. But the disappearance of the Marks sisters belonged to a different category of mystery entirely, one that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of medical knowledge or common sense. Could they have survived the fall? Margaret Marks asked him during a consultation that was really a desperate search for hope wrapped in clinical language. Whitmore had examined the evidence with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his answer would either destroy or preserve a family's ability to function in the aftermath of loss. The cliff face was nearly vertical granite, broken only by occasional ledges that might stop a falling object long enough to change its trajectory toward greater destruction. The river below was deep but narrow, its current swift enough to carry away anything that entered it during the spring melt. Survival would be... He paused, searching for words that balanced honesty with compassion. Extremely unlikely. The height alone would make serious injury inevitable, and the cold water would present additional challenges even for someone who remained conscious. But he didn't mention what troubled him most about the evidence from Widow's Point: the absence of any indication that the sisters had actually fallen. No broken branches on the cliff face, no disturbance in the snow at the bottom, no tracks leading to the edge that suggested panic or accident. Just footprints that approached the void and then stopped, as if their makers had learned to fly or dissolve or step through doorways visible only to themselves. The state investigators arrived on March 17th, 2 days after the disappearance, carrying with them the authority of a government that specialized in solving problems too complex for local resources. Detective Lieutenant Robert Castellano and Sergeant Thomas Wright approached the mystery with the methodical confidence of men who'd seen enough missing persons cases to develop reliable theories about human behavior under stress. Their first interviews revealed a community united in its confusion and divided in its willingness to acknowledge that confusion publicly. "Something's not right about this whole business," Castellano wrote in his initial report. "The local authorities seem competent enough, but there's an undercurrent of secrecy that suggests they're either protecting someone or protecting themselves from something they don't want to examine too closely." The state team's examination of Widow's Point confirmed every detail of Sheriff Hayes's initial report, while adding several troubling observations of their own. The snow conditions had remained stable since the night of the disappearance, preserving the sisters' final journey in perfect detail. But weather records showed that the storm had ended around midnight on March 14th, nearly 4 hours before the estimated time of their arrival at the cliff edge. They were walking through clear weather, Wright noted. Whatever happened up there, it wasn't a case of people getting lost in a blizzard and making a fatal mistake. Which raised the question: what had drawn two sensible young women to make a 3-mile climb through deep snow to reach a place that offered nothing but a view they couldn't see and a danger they couldn't miss. The answer, when it came, would arrive through channels nobody expected and reveal connections that Cedar Ridge had spent decades trying to forget. Mrs. Abigail Winslow had lived alone on her farm since her husband's death from influenza in 1928, surviving through a combination of practical wisdom and the kind of stubborn independence that allowed certain women to thrive in circumstances that would have broken others. She kept chickens that laid reliably, maintained a vegetable garden that produced enough surplus to trade for what she couldn't grow, and possessed a memory for local history that served the community as an unofficial archive of events most people preferred to forget. When Detective Lieutenant Castellano arrived at her farmhouse on March 18th, seeking clarification about the sisters' planned visit, he expected a routine interview about timing and arrangements. What he discovered instead was a story that reached back through decades of careful silence to touch something the community had buried so thoroughly that even the burial had been forgotten. "You want to know about the Marks girls," Mrs. Winslow said, leading him through a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and rising bread dough. "But to understand what happened to them, you'll need to know about the others first." The farmhouse's front parlor had been preserved as a sort of shrine to more prosperous times, when the Winslow dairy had employed 6 men and supplied milk to 3 counties. Photographs lined the mantelpiece. Family gatherings, church socials, community celebrations that documented a world where people smiled for cameras and believed in futures that would be better than their presents. But it was a leather-bound ledger, thick with years of careful record-keeping, that contained the information Castellano hadn't known he was looking for. "Started keeping track in 1918, Mrs. Winslow explained, opening the book to pages covered in neat handwriting. "During the influenza, so many people dying, disappearing, leaving without word. I thought someone should maintain a proper record." The ledger's early entries documented the expected tragedies of a rural community navigating difficult times: deaths from disease, departures for better opportunities in the cities, families who'd lost their farms to bank foreclosures and simply vanished into the broader American landscape of displacement and hope. But beginning in 1925, the entries took on a different character. "September 3rd, 1925, Mrs. Winslow read aloud. "Michael Sullivan, age 34, disappeared while checking his trap lines. Last seen heading toward Widow's Point to investigate reports of unusual sounds. "November 7th, 1926. The Patterson children, ages 12 and 14, failed to return from an afternoon gathering chestnuts. Their tracks were found leading toward the high country. "April 19th, 1928. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson, recently widowed, left her house in the middle of the night. Neighbors reported seeing her walking north on the logging road, carrying only a small bundle. Page after page of disappearances, each documented with the sparse precision of someone who understood that the details mattered even when, especially when, the details refused to form a coherent picture. "How many?" Castellano asked, though he was already counting entries and arriving at numbers that challenged everything he thought he understood about missing person statistics in rural communities. 43 people over 15 years, Mrs. Winslow replied. All of them last seen heading toward Widow's Point. All of them vanished without leaving any evidence of what happened after they reached the cliffs. The detective studied the ledger with the growing unease of someone discovering that what he'd assumed was an isolated tragedy was actually part of a pattern so consistent it suggested design rather than coincidence. Why didn't anyone report this to state authorities? Mrs. Winslow's smile held the particular sadness of someone who'd learned not to expect help from institutions designed to solve problems they couldn't acknowledge. Who would we report to? Sheriff Hayes has seen the pattern same as everyone else. The disappearances happen too slowly to call attention, too regularly to ignore. People develop theories, but theories aren't evidence. And evidence of what, exactly? That our community is cursed? That something's wrong with the cliffs? That 43 people over 15 years decided independently to walk to the same place and vanish? She closed the ledger with the careful reverence of someone handling documentation that might someday serve as testimony in proceedings she couldn't imagine. Besides, most of the people who disappear are already on the margins. The lonely, the troubled, the ones who don't quite fit. Easier to assume they went somewhere else voluntarily than to examine why they might have been drawn to a place that offers nothing but emptiness. Castellano left the Winslow farm with photocopied pages from the ledger and the uncomfortable knowledge that his investigation had expanded from a simple missing persons case into something that challenged basic assumptions about cause, effect, and the reliability of official records. The story Mrs. Winslow had documented suggested that Cedar Ridge wasn't experiencing an outbreak of disappearances, but rather the latest chapter in something that had been happening for decades with a consistency that implied purpose. But purpose implied intelligence, and intelligence implied someone or something responsible for drawing 43 people to their deaths at Widow's Point over the course of 15 years. And that was a conclusion no reasonable investigator could include in an official report. The pull of the void. The revelation of Mrs. Winslow's ledger transformed Detective Lieutenant Castellano's investigation from a search for missing persons into an archaeological expedition through layers of institutional failure and community denial. Working with Sergeant Wright, he began cross-referencing the documented disappearances with official records, seeking evidence that might explain why 43 people had vanished without generating the kind of attention such numbers should have commanded. What they discovered was a masterpiece of bureaucratic compartmentalization. Each disappearance had been handled separately, often by different jurisdictions, as political boundaries shifted and law enforcement responsibilities transferred between local, county, and state authorities. A person missing from Cedar Ridge might be logged as a runaway from Greylock County, while someone who'd actually lived in the county but disappeared near town boundaries could end up filed as a Cedar Ridge case. It's like someone designed a system specifically to prevent pattern recognition, Wright observed, spreading files across the conference table at the state police barracks in Springfield. No single agency ever sees enough cases to recognize what's happening. More troubling was the inconsistency in the quality of investigations. Some disappearances had been thoroughly documented, with statements from witnesses, searches of possible locations, and follow-up inquiries that continued for months. Others merited barely a paragraph in incident reports, dismissed as voluntary departures by troubled individuals seeking fresh starts in different places. The difference seemed to depend less on the circumstances of each case than on the social status of the missing persons and their families' ability to demand attention from authorities already overwhelmed by the cascading crises of economic depression. "Look at this," Castellano said, pointing to a file dated April 19, 1928. "Mrs. Eleanor Davidson disappears in the middle of the night. She's a recent widow, no close family, modest means." The investigating officer, Sheriff Hayes, files a 2-page report concluding she probably went to live with relatives in another state. He pulled out another file, thicker and marked with multiple follow-up reports. Compare that to this one from October of the same year. Jonathan Whitmore, Dr. Whitmore's brother, goes missing after leaving his law office to check on a client. 3 weeks of intensive searching, interviews with dozens of witnesses, coordination with police departments in 4 states. Wright studied both files, noting the obvious disparity in attention and resources. What happened with the Whitmore case? Same thing that happened with all of them. The investigation eventually concluded he'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown and left town voluntarily. Case closed. But the files revealed details that the official conclusions couldn't explain away. Jonathan Whitmore had been seen walking north on the logging road toward Widow's Point on the afternoon of his disappearance. Multiple witnesses confirmed this direction, though none had thought to report it until specifically asked during the investigation. Like the others, his tracks had been found leading toward the cliffs and nowhere else. The pattern held across 15 years of cases, people from all walks of life, all age groups, all social circumstances, drawn to the same destination by forces that left no evidence of their operation beyond the terrible consistency of their results. "What would you do?" Wright asked, voicing the question that had been haunting both investigators. If you were living in a community where people regularly disappeared at a specific location, but the authorities either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the pattern? Castellano considered this while reviewing photographs from various search efforts, images that showed Widow's Point from multiple angles and seasons, documenting a landscape that appeared entirely ordinary except for its association with extraordinary losses. I suppose you'd start to avoid the area, warn your children to stay away, develop local folklore that served as informal protection. But Mrs. Winslow's ledger suggested that even informal protection had limited effectiveness. The disappearances continued at a rate of approximately 3 per year, claiming victims who should have known better, who should have heard the warnings, who should have recognized the danger. Unless the danger was precisely that it didn't feel dangerous, unless whatever drew people to Widow's Point operated below the threshold of conscious recognition, appealing to something deeper than rational fear or community wisdom. The investigators requested permission to examine the cliff site with technical resources unavailable to local authorities. Geological surveys to check for unstable ground that might create sinkholes or unexpected crevasses. Engineering assessments of the rock face to determine if falling objects might be deflected to locations not visible from above. Even experimental psychology consultations to explore whether the cliff environment might create optical illusions or disorienting effects that could explain why so many people had apparently walked into thin air. Every technical examination produced the same conclusion. Widow's Point was a perfectly ordinary granite promontory that posed no unusual hazards beyond the obvious danger of a 200-foot drop onto stone and water. No geological anomalies, no structural weaknesses, no environmental factors that might cause confusion or disorientation. Just a place where people stopped existing, leaving behind only footprints that ended at the edge of everything and questions that multiplied faster than answers. By March 25th, 10 days after the disappearance of Evelyn and Lillian Marks, Detective Lieutenant Castellano found himself drafting a report that would either end his career or transform how missing persons investigations were conducted in rural communities. He chose honesty, documenting the pattern Mrs. Winslow had preserved, the systemic failures that had prevented its recognition, and the urgent need for specialized investigation of a phenomenon that challenged basic assumptions about human behavior and environmental safety. The report was filed, forwarded through appropriate channels, and quietly buried in administrative procedures designed to prevent embarrassing questions about competence and resource allocation. But the sisters were still missing, and the cliffs still waited, and Cedar Ridge still held its breath each time someone walked north on the logging road toward places where footprints ended and stories stopped making sense. 3 weeks after the disappearance of Evelyn and Lillian Marks, Cedar Ridge had developed the peculiar atmosphere of a community under siege by its own secrets. People moved through their daily routines with the careful deliberation of actors who'd forgotten their lines, but hoped their movements might disguise the absence of plot. Margaret Marks continued taking in mending, though her customers now approached her house with the strained courtesy reserved for grieving families whose grief had become inconvenient to witness. James Marks still opened his hardware store each morning at 8, arranging tools that fewer people needed to buy, waiting for customers who increasingly shopped in the larger towns where tragedies belonged to other families and conversations didn't require navigating around the shapes of missing daughters. Sheriff Hayes found himself walking the streets of Cedar Ridge with the heightened awareness of a man who'd discovered that his job description had changed without anyone officially acknowledging the transformation. He was no longer simply maintaining public order in a community where disorder was largely a matter of property disputes and occasional public drunkenness. He was now the custodian of a mystery that threatened to expose 15 years of institutional failure and community denial. The state investigators had departed, taking with them copies of Mrs. Winslow's ledger and promises of further inquiry that Hayes understood would evaporate as soon as their reports reached bureaucrats who specialized in managing problems by reclassifying them as non-problems. Detective Lieutenant Castellano had been professional and thorough, but his final handshake carried the weight of someone who knew he was abandoning a battle he wasn't equipped to win. "What now?" Deputy Morrison asked during their weekly review of open cases, a meeting that had once focused on stolen property and domestic disputes, but now revolved around the question that nobody wanted to ask directly. Hayes looked out the window of his office toward the northern mountains, where the snow was finally beginning to melt and reveal the landscape that winter had temporarily transformed into something beautiful and alien. "Now we wait," he said, "and we pay attention, and we try to make sure it doesn't happen again." But prevention required understanding, and understanding required acknowledging patterns that challenged everything the community had told itself about the nature of its losses. More than 40 people over 15 years, all of them last seen heading toward Widow's Point. All of them vanished without leaving evidence of what had happened after they reached the cliffs. The numbers demanded explanations that reasonable people couldn't provide. On April 2nd, 1933, those numbers changed again. Thomas Murphy, age 38, owner and operator of Murphy's Inn, left his establishment around 9:15 p.m. to investigate what he described to his wife as strange sounds coming from the direction of the cliffs. He was an experienced woodsman, familiar with every trail and landmark within 10 miles of Cedar Ridge, not given to panic or impulsive decisions. His wife found his body the next morning at the base of Widow's Point, broken on rocks that had been waiting for decades to receive such gifts. The local doctor's examination revealed injuries consistent with a fall from significant height, though several details troubled the medical assessment. The body's position suggested Murphy had landed in deep snow that should have cushioned his impact, and his clothing showed tears that didn't match the expected pattern of damage from contact with granite surfaces. More puzzling was the location of the body itself. Previous searches of the cliff base had been thorough and systematic, documenting every boulder, every tree, every possible hiding place where falling objects might come to rest. Thomas Murphy's body lay in a depression that searchers had examined multiple times during their efforts to find the Marks sisters 3 weeks earlier. It was as if the cliffs had temporarily concealed what they'd received, then chosen to reveal it when the revelation would have maximum impact on a community already struggling to maintain its equilibrium. Sheriff Hayes stood at the edge of Widow's Point on the afternoon of April 3rd, looking down at the place where Murphy's body had been discovered. trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he understood about cause and effect. The granite ledge showed no signs of disturbance, no scuff marks or broken stone that would indicate someone had slipped or fallen. Murphy's tracks approached the cliff edge with the same inexplicable directness that had characterized the footprints of every other person who disappeared at this location. But unlike the others, Thomas Murphy had left behind a body, evidence of ending rather than simply ending itself. "Why him?" Deputy Morrison asked, voicing the question that was transforming grief into something more dangerous. The recognition that some force was making choices about who lived and who died, who disappeared and who was found. Hayes couldn't answer because any honest response would require acknowledging possibilities that fell outside the boundaries of law enforcement training and community leadership. That something in or about Widow's Point was actively drawing people to their deaths. That the disappearances weren't random tragedies, but expressions of intent that operated according to rules nobody understood. That Cedar Ridge was home to something that fed on human lives and had been feeding for 15 years without anyone having the courage to name what was happening or the power to stop it. The cliff's appetite. The death of Thomas Murphy shattered the careful equilibrium that had allowed Cedar Ridge to function despite its growing catalog of losses. Unlike the disappeared, who could be explained away as voluntary departures or accidents in remote locations, Murphy's broken body demanded acknowledgement that something was systematically wrong with the geography around Widow's Point. The town's response revealed 15 years of practiced denial suddenly colliding with evidence that couldn't be wished away or reclassified as someone else's problem. Dr. Charles Whitmore found himself conducting an autopsy that would either confirm the community's worst fears or provide evidence for a more acceptable explanation of Murphy's death. His examination revealed injuries consistent with impact trauma from a significant height. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, damage to major organs. But the pattern of wounds suggested Murphy had struck several surfaces during his fall, ricocheting between granite outcroppings before coming to rest at the cliff base. The problem was that no such outcroppings existed on the face of Widow's Point. The granite wall dropped in an almost vertical line from the rim to the talus slope below, broken only by shallow ledges that might slow a falling body without redirecting its trajectory significantly. "It's as if he bounced," Whitmore confided to Sheriff Hayes during a conversation that both men knew would never appear in any official record. The damage pattern suggests multiple impacts with hard surfaces at different angles, but the cliff face doesn't provide opportunities for that kind of choreographed destruction. Hayes absorbed this information with the weary attention of someone who'd spent 3 weeks discovering that his understanding of local geography was incomplete in ways that defied mapping. Could there be caves? Hidden ledges? Something we haven't found? "I've climbed those cliffs," Whitmore replied. "So have you. So have half the men in this county. If there were features capable of catching and redirecting a falling body, we'd know about them." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Sarah Murphy, the innkeeper's widow, arriving at the doctor's office with questions that cut straight to the heart of what everyone was thinking, but nobody was willing to say directly. "Was it suicide?" she asked, her voice carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who'd spent days preparing for this moment. "Did Thomas throw himself off those cliffs because of whatever's been happening up there?" Whitmore exchanged glances with Sheriff Hayes, both men recognizing the moment when careful diplomacy would either preserve a family's peace of mind or begin the process of communal honesty that Cedar Ridge had been avoiding for 15 years. "The evidence doesn't support that conclusion," Whitmore said carefully. "Thomas's injuries suggest he fell, but there's no indication he jumped intentionally. What he didn't mention was the absence of evidence for accident as well. Thomas Murphy had approached the cliff edge on a clear night with good visibility, following a route he'd traveled dozens of times during his life in Cedar Ridge. He'd been sober, alert, and responding to sounds that had concerned him enough to leave a warm inn and investigate their source. People like Thomas Murphy didn't simply walk off cliffs by mistake. Then what happened to him? Mrs. Murphy asked, her question expanding beyond her husband's death to encompass the broader mystery that had been consuming their community one person at a time for more than a decade. Hayes found himself facing the choice that every authority figure eventually confronts when institutional responses prove inadequate to institutional problems. Whether to maintain comforting lies or risk everything on uncomfortable truths. Mrs. Murphy, he said slowly, I think we need to have a town meeting. I think it's time for everyone to stop pretending they don't see what's been happening here. The meeting was scheduled for April 7th at the Methodist Church, the only building in Cedar Ridge large enough to accommodate the entire community. Word spread through the social networks that connected households, businesses, and families into the complex organism of small-town life. By the appointed evening, nearly 200 people had gathered to hear what their elected officials might finally be willing to acknowledge about the pattern of losses that had been shaping their lives for 15 years. Sheriff Hayes stood at the front of the church, looking out over faces that reflected every possible combination of fear, anger, curiosity, and denial. He'd spent 3 days preparing remarks that would balance honesty with responsibility, revelation with reassurance. But standing before the assembled community, he realized that half measures would no longer suffice. Thomas Murphy is dead, he began, his words carrying across a silence so complete that everyone could hear the wind pressing against the church windows. He's the 44th person we've lost to Widow's Point since 1918. 44 people who walked to those cliffs and didn't walk back. The number hit the congregation like a physical blow. People who'd spent years treating each disappearance as an isolated tragedy suddenly confronted the mathematical reality of systematic loss. Nearly 3 people per year drawn to the same location vanished under circumstances that defied explanation. We've all known something was wrong, Hayes continued. We've all seen the pattern, but we've been content to treat each case separately, to find individual explanations for what might be a collective problem. That ends tonight. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins stood up in the third pew, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades documenting community dynamics with scientific precision. What are you suggesting, Sheriff? That something supernatural is killing our neighbors? The word supernatural hung in the air like incense, filling spaces between rational thought with possibilities that reasonable people weren't supposed to acknowledge. But reasonable explanations had already failed to account for 44 disappearances and 1 death that had occurred under circumstances that violated basic principles of physics and geography. I'm suggesting, Hayes replied, that we stop ignoring evidence because it doesn't fit our assumptions about what's possible. I'm suggesting that we start treating Widow's Point as a place of active danger and take steps to protect ourselves accordingly. But protection required understanding, and understanding required confronting the possibility that Cedar Ridge was home to something that existed outside the boundaries of conventional knowledge, something that fed on human life and had been feeding undisturbed for 15 years because the community had chosen willful blindness over difficult truths. The choice was no longer whether to acknowledge the monster. The choice was whether to fight it or continue feeding it through denial disguised as rational skepticism. Dr. Charles Whitmore had always prided himself on the methodical approach that made him an effective physician in a community where medical resources were limited and diagnostic errors could prove fatal. His practice depended on careful observation, systematic thinking, and the ability to recognize patterns that might escape less disciplined attention. These skills, honed through 2 decades of treating everything from childhood diseases to industrial accidents, proved essential when applied to a mystery that existed outside the boundaries of medical knowledge. Following the town meeting of April 7th, Whitmore found himself unable to concentrate on routine patient care. The revelation that 44 people had disappeared at Widow's Point over 15 years had transformed his understanding of every unusual death, every unexplained illness, every case where symptoms didn't match standard diagnostic criteria. He began reviewing his medical records with the uncomfortable suspicion that he'd been treating effects while ignoring their cause for most of his professional career. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he understood about the practice of medicine in Cedar Ridge. Since 1918, his records showed a statistically significant increase in several categories of patient complaints: chronic fatigue without identifiable cause, persistent headaches unrelated to injury or infection, sleep disorders characterized by vivid nightmares involving heights and falling, and a peculiar form of anxiety that patients consistently described as feeling watched or being called, but couldn't link to any specific trigger. More troubling was the geographic distribution of these symptoms. Patients living in the northern sections of Cedar Ridge, the areas closest to Widow's Point, experienced rates of unexplained illness nearly 3 times higher than those living in the southern part of town. The correlation was strong enough to suggest environmental causation, but no known environmental factors could account for the specific pattern of health effects he was documenting. "It's as if something's draining them," he confided to his wife during a dinner that had grown cold while he wrestled with data that demanded explanations he wasn't trained to provide. Not quickly enough to cause obvious harm, but consistently enough to show up in aggregate health statistics. Mrs. Dorothy Whitmore had married a rational man who solved problems through systematic analysis and evidence-based conclusions. Watching him struggle with mysteries that violated those principles was almost as disturbing as the mystery itself. Could it be psychological? She suggested. Living in a community where people regularly disappear might create stress that manifests as physical symptoms. Whitmore considered this while studying charts that showed the progression of chronic fatigue cases over the past decade. Psychological stress can certainly cause physical symptoms, he agreed, but the timing doesn't match. Many of these cases predate the patient's awareness of the disappearance pattern, and the geographic clustering suggests something more specific than generalized anxiety. He pulled out a map of Cedar Ridge that he'd been marking with the addresses of patients who'd reported chronic, unexplained symptoms. Red dots clustered heavily in the northern neighborhoods, scattered more sparsely through the central areas, and appeared almost not at all in the southern sections of town. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the concentration of markers near the base of the mountains. "It's as if there's something emanating from Widow's Point that affects people's health in proportion to their proximity to the source." The implications were staggering. If some force associated with the cliff site was capable of influencing human physiology from a distance, then the disappearances might represent extreme cases of a phenomenon that was affecting the entire community at subtler levels. People weren't simply being drawn to their deaths at Widow's Point. They were being systematically weakened, made more susceptible to influence, prepared for eventual harvest. Whitmore spent the next week conducting follow-up examinations of patients who'd reported chronic symptoms, asking questions he'd never thought to ask before. When had their symptoms begun? Had they noticed any correlation between their condition and time spent in different parts of town? Did they experience unusual dreams or compulsions that might relate to their physical complaints? The answers painted a disturbing picture of a community under sustained but subtle attack. Patient after patient described the gradual onset of fatigue and sleep disturbances that seemed to intensify when they spent time in the northern areas of Cedar Ridge. Many reported dreams of walking through snow toward places they couldn't identify, waking with the sensation that they'd been traveling great distances in their sleep. Most troubling were the descriptions of what several patients called the calling, a sense that something was trying to communicate with them through channels that bypassed conscious awareness. The sensation was strongest during late evening hours and seemed to pull their attention toward the mountains that rose beyond the edge of town. "It's like being thirsty," explained Mrs. Janet Morrison, the deputy's wife, during an examination that had revealed no physical cause for her chronic exhaustion. But instead of wanting water, you want to walk somewhere specific, somewhere you know you shouldn't go. Whitmore documented these conversations with the meticulous care of someone who understood that medical records might someday serve as evidence in proceedings he couldn't imagine. He was building a case for the prosecution of something that had no legal definition, collecting testimony about crimes that violated natural law rather than criminal statutes. But the evidence pointed toward an uncomfortable conclusion. Widow's Point wasn't simply a place where people happened to die. It was the focal point of something that actively hunted human prey, using methods that operated below the threshold of conscious recognition to weaken, disorient, and eventually claim victims who never understood what was happening to them. Dr. Whitmore closed his research notes on April 14th, exactly 1 month after the disappearance of Evelyn and Lillian Marks, and began drafting a letter to state health authorities that would either result in a comprehensive investigation of Cedar Ridge's medical anomalies or mark the end of his professional credibility. He chose truth over comfort, documenting the pattern of unexplained illness, the geographic clustering of symptoms, and the urgent need for specialized investigation of a phenomenon that challenged basic assumptions about environmental health and human physiology. The letter was mailed on April 15th and disappeared into bureaucratic channels designed to prevent uncomfortable questions about competence and resource allocation. But the sickness continued to spread through Cedar Ridge's northern neighborhoods, and the dreams grew more vivid, and the calling grew stronger for people who were running out of resistance to something that had been feeding on their community for 15 years without ever announcing its presence or declaring its intentions. The hunger that waits. April 22nd, 1933, brought to Cedar Ridge the kind of spring evening that makes people forget winter's lessons about the malevolence of beautiful weather. The air carried the scent of melting snow and emerging earth, promising renewal and growth in defiance of everything the past month had revealed about the true nature of their community's relationship with the landscape that surrounded it. But underneath the seasonal optimism lay currents of tension that had been building since the town meeting 2 weeks earlier. Sheriff Hayes's revelation about the 44 disappearances had shattered the careful consensus that allowed people to function despite their losses. Now everyone was watching everyone else for signs of the chronic fatigue that Dr. Whitmore had identified, listening for references to dreams about walking through snow, paying attention to who spent too much time looking north toward the mountains. The surveillance was mutual, comprehensive, and ultimately futile. At 8:43 p.m., Mrs. Ruth Henderson left her house on Maple Street to take what she told her husband would be a quick walk to clear her head. She was 46 years old, mother of 3 children who'd moved to Boston and Springfield, and Hartford seeking opportunities that Cedar Ridge couldn't provide. She'd lived in the community for 22 years without ever expressing interest in hiking or exploring the wilderness areas beyond the edge of town. Her husband found her missing at 10:15 p.m. when he realized she hadn't returned from her walk. Her tracks were discovered the next morning by a search party that had learned to follow such trails with the grim efficiency of experience. Like all the others, her footprints led north through the forest, toward Widow's Point, showing no signs of hesitation or distress until they reached the cliff edge and simply stopped. But Mrs. Henderson's disappearance was different in one crucial respect. She hadn't made the journey alone. The search party found evidence of a second person who'd walked with her for the final mile of her journey. The tracks were smaller, lighter, suggesting someone young and slight who'd kept pace with Mrs. Henderson's steady progress toward the cliffs. The two sets of prints maintained parallel courses, occasionally coming together as if their makers had paused for conversation, then separating again as they continued their march toward the void. At the cliff edge, both sets of tracks ended with the same impossible precision that had characterized every other disappearance at Widow's Point. No evidence of struggle or accident. No indication that either person had tried to turn back. Just footprints that approached the edge of everything and then became nothing, as if their makers had learned to dissolve rather than die. Sheriff Hayes stood at the rim of Widow's Point on the morning of April the 23rd, staring down at evidence that transformed the mystery from a series of individual tragedies into something that demanded recognition as organized predation. Two people had walked to this place together, drawn by forces that operated with sufficient sophistication to coordinate multiple victims. The smaller tracks, Deputy Morrison observed, kneeling beside the prints that would disappear as soon as the next weather system reached Cedar Ridge. They looked like they might belong to a child. The possibility hit the search party like a physical blow. If children were being drawn to Widow's Point along with adults, then the community's informal protection strategies, warning people to avoid the area, keeping children away from the northern trails, had already failed. Whatever force operated from the cliff site was capable of overcoming parental supervision, childhood caution, and every other barrier that reasonable people might erect against unreasonable dangers. Hayes examined the smaller tracks with the methodical attention of someone who understood that his findings would either confirm or refute the worst fears of a community already stretched beyond its capacity for rational response. The prints were definitely those of a young person, probably aged 12 to 15 based on size and stride length, but they showed none of the irregular patterns that might indicate fear, confusion, or coercion. Like Mrs. Henderson's tracks, they suggested someone walking with purpose and determination toward a destination they'd chosen freely. "We need to account for every child in town," Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who just realized that his job description had expanded to include protecting the innocent from threats that had no legal definition. "Door-to-door checks. Make sure everyone's accounted for." The canvass of Cedar Ridge took 3 hours and revealed that every family's children were present and safe. No missing persons reports. No evidence of unauthorized absence from any household. The mysterious second set of tracks belonged to someone who either didn't live in the community or had been so thoroughly forgotten that their absence wouldn't be noticed. But Dr. Whitmore's examination of the prints revealed details that challenged even these unsettling conclusions. The tread pattern belonged to a style of shoe that hadn't been manufactured for several years. The depth and clarity of the impressions suggested someone who'd been wearing boots designed for winter conditions, despite the mild spring weather. Most disturbing of all, the spacing and rhythm of the steps indicated someone who'd been walking in snow that was significantly deeper than what had accumulated during the April 22nd evening, when Mrs. Henderson had begun her final journey. It's as if they were walking in different weather, Whitmore confided to Hayes during a conversation that both men knew would sound like madness if overheard by anyone who hadn't spent the past month documenting evidence that violated basic principles of time, space, and causation. Different weather or different times, Hayes replied, voicing the possibility that neither man wanted to examine too closely. Maybe whoever left those tracks wasn't walking with Mrs. Henderson last night. Maybe they were walking with her in some other version of last night that happened years ago. The suggestion that Widow's Point might serve as a meeting place for victims, separated by time as well as death, hung between them like smoke from a fire they couldn't see, but were definitely breathing. If the cliffside existed outside normal temporal boundaries, then the disappearances weren't simply murders. They were kidnappings into a version of reality where the missing continued to exist and walk and occasionally accompany new victims on journeys toward the edge of everything. Standing at the rim of Widow's Point as afternoon shadows grew long and blue, Sheriff Hayes found himself confronting the possibility that his community had been feeding something for 15 years that existed in dimensions law enforcement wasn't equipped to patrol or protect against. But knowing the nature of the enemy was the first step toward fighting it. And fight they must, because the alternative was watching Cedar Ridge empty one person. By the 1st of May, 1933, Cedar Ridge had developed the peculiar atmosphere of a community under siege by forces it couldn't name or fight through conventional means. The disappearance of Mrs. Ruth Henderson and her mysterious companion had shattered what remained of the town's ability to maintain normal routines in the face of abnormal circumstances. People stopped taking evening walks. Parents instituted strict curfews that kept children indoors after sunset. The northern sections of town, closest to Widow's Point, began showing signs of abandonment as families chose to relocate rather than continue living in proximity to whatever was drawing victims to the cliffs. But relocation proved to be an incomplete solution to a problem that operated according to rules nobody understood. Mrs. Alice Morrison, Deputy Morrison's mother, had moved from her house on Pine Street to a boarding facility in Springfield, 20 miles south of Cedar Ridge, specifically to escape what her son described as the influence of whatever's happening up there. She'd been living safely in the city for 2 weeks when she disappeared from her locked room on the night of May 4th, leaving behind only a note written in handwriting that her family didn't recognize. Gone to walk in the snow. Don't follow. The Springfield police found her body at the base of Widow's Point 3 days later. The discovery transformed the mystery from a local phenomenon into something that operated across distances and boundaries that should have provided protection. Whatever force was claiming victims at the cliffs wasn't limited by geography or physical proximity. It could reach out across 20 miles of Massachusetts countryside to reclaim someone who'd tried to escape its influence. Dr. Whitmore's examination of Mrs. Morrison revealed injuries consistent with a fall from significant height, but also evidence that challenged everything he thought he understood about time, distance, and human physiology. Her body showed signs of prolonged exposure to cold weather, despite having disappeared during a mild spring night. Her clothing was soaked with melted snow, though no snow had fallen in central Massachusetts for more than a week. Most disturbing of all, her pockets contained pine needles from trees that grew only in the forests around Cedar Ridge. Forests she shouldn't have been able to reach from Springfield without transportation that left no trace of its use. It's as if she was walking through winter, Whitmore told Sheriff Hayes during an examination that revealed more questions than answers. Her body shows all the signs of someone who spent hours trudging through deep snow in freezing conditions. But the weather records show clear skies and temperatures in the 60s for the entire night of her disappearance. Hayes studied photographs of Mrs. Morrison's body with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned that evidence in Cedar Ridge often violated basic principles of cause and effect. The images showed a woman who died from injuries sustained in a fall, but who'd apparently spent her final hours in environmental conditions that existed only in memory or nightmare. Could she have been walking through the same storm that killed the Marks sisters? He asked, voicing a possibility that challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of time and death. Or every storm that ever brought someone to those cliffs, Whitmore replied. Maybe Widow's Point exists in all weather simultaneously, and when people are drawn there, they experience whatever conditions were present when they first felt the calling. The theory suggested that the cliff site served as more than a location for disappearances. It was a convergence point where past and present collapsed into a single moment of eternal ending. Victims weren't simply dying at Widow's Point. They were joining something that had been growing for decades, fed by the life force of 46 people who'd walked into snow that fell in every season and weather that existed outside normal time. Sheriff Hayes closed the case file on Mrs. Morrison's death and began drafting a report that would either result in federal investigation of Cedar Ridge's anomalies or mark the end of his law enforcement career. He was documenting evidence of phenomena that challenged basic assumptions about reality, requesting resources to fight an enemy that had no legal definition, proposing solutions to problems that violated every principle of rational investigation. But rationality had already failed to protect his community from 15 years of systematic predation. Mrs. Morrison's death proved that escape was impossible, relocation was futile, and whatever was feeding at Widow's Point would continue feeding until someone found a way to break the pattern that had been drawing victims to the cliffs since 1918. The report was completed on May 8th and submitted through official channels to state and federal authorities who specialized in managing problems that couldn't be solved through conventional law enforcement techniques. Hayes requested immediate deployment of specialized investigative resources, comprehensive examination of Widow's Point by experts in atmospheric phenomena and geological anomalies, and coordination with military officials who might have experience with threats that existed outside normal parameters of human conflict. The response, when it came 3 weeks later, consisted of a form letter acknowledging receipt of his report and advising him that his concerns had been forwarded to appropriate agencies for evaluation and possible action. No investigators arrived in Cedar Ridge. No specialists examined the cliff site. No additional resources became available for protecting a community that was being systematically consumed by something that had been feeding undisturbed for 15 years. But the disappearances continued, claiming victims who should have been safe, who should have been warned, who should have been protected by distance and knowledge and the kind of rational precautions that work against ordinary dangers. Sheriff Hayes realized that Cedar Ridge would have to save itself, using whatever weapons a small community could assemble against an enemy that existed in dimensions law enforcement wasn't trained to patrol. The battle for Cedar Ridge was about to begin. By June of 1933, the transformation of Cedar Ridge was complete. What had once been a community struggling with economic depression had become something unprecedented in American history. A town united in open warfare against forces that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality, death, and the boundaries between possible and impossible. Sheriff Hayes had abandoned any pretense of conducting normal law enforcement activities. His office became a command center for operations that would have seemed like madness to outside observers, but had become essential for survival in a place where 46 people had vanished into thin air over 15 years, claimed by something that fed on human life and showed no signs of satisfaction despite its substantial harvest. The community's response combined folk wisdom with desperate innovation. Mrs. Abigail Winslow's ledger became the foundation for a comprehensive database tracking every unusual incident, every reported dream about walking in snow, every case of the chronic fatigue that Dr. Whitmore had identified as a precursor to more serious effects. Families instituted buddy systems that prevented anyone from walking alone after sunset. Churches organized round-the-clock prayer vigils that served as informal surveillance networks for monitoring community members who might be experiencing the early stages of whatever process culminated in the journey to Widow's Point. But the most significant development was the emergence of what Hayes privately called the Watchers, volunteers who maintained continuous observation of the cliff site from concealed positions, documenting any unusual activity that might reveal the nature of what was claiming their neighbors. The Watchers discovered that Widow's Point was far from inactive during the periods between disappearances. On clear nights, observers reported strange lights moving along the cliff face, sounds of voices calling from empty air, and occasional glimpses of figures walking along paths that weren't visible in daylight. Most disturbing were the accounts of snow falling in isolated areas around the cliff site, regardless of season or weather conditions, as if winter was a permanent feature of the landscape that became visible only under specific circumstances. "It's building something," reported Marcus Webb, a timber worker who'd volunteered for night surveillance despite having 2 young children and every reason to avoid unnecessary risks. "Whatever's up there, it's not just taking people randomly. It's accumulating them for some purpose we don't understand yet." The purpose became clearer on June 21st, the longest day of 1933, when the accumulated evidence finally revealed the true scope of what Cedar Ridge was fighting. Dr. Whitmore's analysis of health records dating back to 1918 showed that the chronic symptoms affecting northern residents had been steadily increasing in severity and geographic scope. What had begun as isolated cases of unexplained fatigue had evolved into a pattern of community-wide health effects that suggested systematic energy drain from a growing percentage of the population. People weren't just being prepared for eventual harvest at Widow's Point. They were being used as sources of ongoing sustenance that fed something's growth over time. The medical evidence pointed toward an uncomfortable conclusion. Whatever was operating from the cliff site had been growing stronger, more sophisticated, more capable of influencing human behavior across greater distances. Mrs. Morrison's death in Springfield wasn't an anomaly. It was a demonstration of expanding capabilities that would eventually allow the entity to claim victims from anywhere in New England, then anywhere in the country, then anywhere in the world. Cedar Ridge wasn't experiencing a local phenomenon. It was serving as ground zero for something that intended to extend its feeding territory until it encompassed all human population centers. Sheriff Hayes convened an emergency meeting on June 22nd, gathering the community leaders who'd been coordinating resistance efforts since May. The group included Dr. Whitmore, Deputy Morrison, Mrs. Winslow, several members of the volunteer surveillance teams, and Father Michael O'Brien from St. Patrick's Catholic Church, who'd been documenting what he carefully described as spiritual anomalies associated with the cliff site. "We have 2 choices," Hayes told the assembled group. "We can abandon Cedar Ridge and hope that whatever's up there doesn't follow us to our new homes. Or we can find a way to destroy it before it grows strong enough to extend its range beyond what we've already seen." The vote was unanimous. They would fight. But fighting required weapons, and weapons required understanding of what they were fighting against. The community organized itself into research teams that approached the mystery from every available angle. Historical investigation to determine when and how the entity had established itself at Widow's Point. scientific analysis of the environmental anomalies associated with the cliff site, and careful examination of folklore from other regions that might describe similar phenomena. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Cedar Ridge wasn't unique. Historical records from across New England contained accounts of places where people regularly disappeared under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Native American oral traditions included warnings about locations where hungry spirits claimed human lives for purposes that remained mysterious to those who survived to pass down the stories. But the records also suggested that such entities could be contained, weakened, or destroyed through methods that combined ritual knowledge with systematic disruption of their feeding patterns. The summer of 1933 became a season of preparation for a confrontation that would determine whether Cedar Ridge survived as a community or became another abandoned settlement where something patient and eternal waited for new victims to replace the old ones.